Hello, and welcome to the Pragmatic Product Chat Series, where we tackle the biggest challenges facing today's product management, product marketing, and other market and data-driven professionals with some of the best minds in the industry. I'm Rebecca Kalogeris for Pragmatic Institute, your host for this episode. Before we jump into this episode and why I'm so very excited about our guests, a couple of reminders and a very, very exciting announcement. So a reminder, if you enjoy the podcast, if you love having Rebecca in your ears on a weekly basis, please take a few minutes just to give us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever it is you listen to your podcasts. They can make a difference because they help other people find the podcast. And I do enjoy doing them. The second thing is a reminder that we are now taking listeners' calls at the end, or listeners' questions at the end of the show. So if you have a question you want me to answer or to find an answer for and provide at the end of the show, please send your question, your name and title, and of course your question to productchats@pragmaticinstitute.com. Or you can call and leave a voicemail with your question at 480-536-6835. Now, before we go in, I do have a really actually super exciting announcement that Pragmatic Institute is hosting the Future of Product Management Summit. That summit's going to be September 18th from 12 to 5 Eastern. Has a ton of variety of really good topics, sort of everything you need to know about how to do product management and product marketing really well today, but also the things that you're going to need in the future as this continues to evolve. And I bring this up in particular because our guest today is actually the keynote speaker for the event. His name is Cal Al-Dhubaib. He is a globally recognized data scientist, entrepreneur, and innovator of responsible artificial intelligence. He specializes in really heavily regulated sectors such as healthcare, energy, defense, and he currently leads AI and data science at Further, which is a private privacy-first data analytics company that has over 100 of the Fortune 500 companies. So they do some really great projects that he's going to tell us about. So I'm extremely excited to have him on board as we talk about building generative experiences and human-focused products using generative AI. Hello, and welcome to the Pragmatic Product Chat Series, where we tackle the biggest challenges facing today's product management, product marketing, and other market and data-driven professionals with some of the best minds in the industry. I'm Rebecca Kalogeris for Pragmatic Institute and your host for this episode. So one thing that we're all hearing about, all being pushed to figure out how to use and leverage in our products and in our day-to-day lives is AI, right? So there's been lots of conversations about AI, but what I'm super, super excited about today is like the guest we have today has such deep experience with AI and it's such a deep understanding of the pros and the cons and the advantages that I think it's going to be just an amazing conversation. So I'm extremely excited to have on the show Cal Al-Dhubaib, who's a globally recognized data scientist, entrepreneur, innovator, really focused on responsible artificial intelligence and really also has a big sort of focus on heavily regulated sectors, right? Healthcare, energy, defense, where that's sort of like responsibility and ethics plays an even bigger role. He leads AI Today and data science at Further, which is a privacy-first data analytics and AI company that supports over 100 of the Fortune 500, which is an enviable list for sure. So we are very excited to have you here, Cal. Thanks for joining the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Rebecca.
All right. And we may even get a special guest appearance from Oreo the cat. So we'll just all keep our eyes open for that one.
Indeed.
But yes. All right, Cal, I always like to start sort of with your origin story, right? What is it how you got where you are today and why you are so very passionate about what it is that you do?
Love that question. So I'm a data scientist by training. And a little fun fact that I love to share is that I actually changed my major 7 times while I was an undergraduate student, to my family's, great delight at the time. But I kept hopping between professions because I couldn't quite find what I loved. And so I was a little bit of programming. I didn't quite like computer science. And then I jumped into cognitive science. And then I fell in love with neuroscience. And ultimately, I found myself in this world of data. And I started getting really excited about the fact that you could identify patterns and predict patterns at scale and maybe start to do useful things with that. So I found myself practicing data science, and my university in 2014 announced that they were going to open up this program for this emerging discipline. And at the time, it's crazy. Very few people knew what it was outside the coastal tech hubs. And I call my parents and I say, I'm going to change my major one more time. So long story short, when I was going to school at Case here in Cleveland, there were fewer than 150 data scientists in the whole region. A third of them worked for one of three organizations, Explorers, which was then became IBM Watson Health, the Cleveland Clinic, or Progressive Insurance, and then fractions everywhere else. And it was in the middle of that I realized there is a gap in talent to be able to work on these types of problems. So I started Pandata, and over 8 years, built up a bench of talent and got to work with some really exciting organizations. I found myself moving from all things data into these machine learning and AI focused projects. So this part of using AI, which is software that recognizes patterns and then does something with it, and building them into workflows. And I found that there was an even bigger need for this in these heavily regulated environments. One, because these were projects nobody wanted to touch. Right. These models had a weird way of breaking. And I started to become obsessed with, well, how do we make these things safe and useful? And we built up a solid set of practices and an approach to finding the right things to build, knowing when to walk away, and how to build trust between AI-based workflows and then the users that depend on them and stakeholders that make sure that we're not creating harm or experience unintended consequences. So long story short, that's how I went from just crazy student bouncing from thing to thing to obsessed with data science and AI and heavily regulated industries. And then Pandata and our whole team was acquired by Further just 3 months ago.
Oh, wow. That's always exciting too. So yeah. I suspect after giving your parents many a heart attack on the changing of majors, they're very excited with where you ended up.
Indeed. Well, let's follow up changing all the majors with, I think I'm going to start a company too.
At least you finished the major, right? I mean, you got to get points there.
Indeed.
Yes. So one of the things, there's so many great things there, but one of the things you mentioned right at the end there was figuring out the right things to build and when to walk away. And let's dig into that, because that is the crux of what we do in product, is try to figure out what's the right thing to build, but also in this case, what's the right way to build it, right? Is this technology a good fit for it? So tell me a little bit about what you discovered about finding the right thing to build.
Here's the truth about AI. It will be wrong some amount of the time. Right? So
yes,
AI isn't about can we get it to work at this problem? It's can we get it to be useful in context of this problem, right? The art in designing these AI systems isn't about getting it to 100% accuracy, but learning to reconfigure workflows in a way. And because this all comes down to stats, right? Statistical models aren't going to capture 100% of the signal. There's always going to be anomalies. And there's this misperception today in the market that it's AI or human. And one of our core beliefs is it's a mixture of both. And just to give you an example of a project that we were recently working on, it was in the context of an innovation project and a health system that would help determine whether or not a certain type of treatment course was appropriate. This treatment course, without getting into the details of the specifics, it's very expensive, and over-treating is a drain on health systems. But if the patient isn't treated appropriately, it causes long-term effects. And this is something that needs to happen over a sequence of months or weeks. And so it's a machine learning model that's going to be used along those lines. And we're now in the phases of trying to figure out where is this useful, or where is the next generation of this model going to be useful. Today, current state, because a lot of this information might not be updated about the patient's case until 24 hours after their initial visit, there's a model that's right about 90% of the time, but it's only available after the decision happens. The model that we're working on today is right 50% of the time, but it's available at the time the treatment is being ordered. Not so useful. But if you could flip this on its head and say, we know when the model's likely to be wrong, and we're just going to discard all of these cases. We're going to do nothing. And we know where the model's more likely to be right. And we're going to send an alert or an intervention to the ordering physician to let them know that it might not be appropriate. And here are the leading reasons why. We've now taken the size of the problem, we've cut it in half, and then maybe we influence about a quarter or a third of those decisions. And is there value in it? Absolutely. We might otherwise avoid drains on a health system or trigger an alert that says this might not be appropriate. Let's take a second look or escalate or change the decision that had occurred. And when we were working with the health system on this, they're like, that's tremendously valuable because today, if it becomes an alert every time the model thinks something's wrong and it's wrong half the time, physicians get alert fatigue and they're not going to trust it.
They're not going to listen
to
it anymore.
That's one example of how that's just one of many, many examples of how this plays out.
It's a really great example too, because you see the complexities of it, right? Like when you just say like, it's right 50% of the time, you're like, well, obviously, so is a coin flip. So really, Cal, I don't want my medical decisions done that way. But understanding though that that's true at a global scale, but that you can understand whether you're likely to get, if I eliminate the places where it's but where I'm likely to get a false positive or an actual positive, you can start to hone in on that. And then the other piece of that is this is not, and this is the important piece, this is not letting AI make the decision for what my healthcare will be. This is AI providing a flag to the doctor who's very busy and looking at a bunch of different things and absolutely doing their best of when they may want to relook, right? And then they may still look at it and go, yeah, no, but so we're good. But that really is, as you say, putting it as part of the workflow. Instead of thinking it as the solution in of itself, it's how can I use this? Where am I giving it enough information that those notifications are meaningful and not noise?
Absolutely. And the same is true in the context of customer experience, maybe a little bit lower stakes, but there are the types of inquiries where you have a high confidence that a model will be able to handle it. There are those where you want to pre-populate a response or a template or even suggest something to a human operator, and ones where you say human only. We're not even going to attempt to solve this. And so it becomes this useful workflow orchestration. And yes, you can do more with the humans that you have. And let's not forget that there's a whole new role that needs to be created as part of this that's auditing the use of these systems and making sure that we're still following appropriate decision making and that we're not creating these unintended consequences.
That's interesting too. When you think about that additional role, where do you see that in an organization?
Depends on the nature of what we're doing, but it can be a function of risk management. It can be a function of product where it's a part of monitoring, quality control. It can be a part of data science or the engineering team supporting a solution if it's looking more at the performance of the model or looking at patterns over time. But these are typically things or roles that wouldn't have been as prevalent in traditional software.
So that's super interesting. Okay, so what other, when we're thinking about things to build, right? We're talking about, where the model will be accurate enough to be useful, right? Where it can fit in a human workflow. What other aspects of it you're like, ooh, this is a problem or situation where AI might be a helpful piece? What other factors?
So it can be, and I love this because it doesn't always have to be about like finding the model that's useful enough for the problem. It can be saying, all right, we have this model. Where can this model be useful?
I have a tool. What could I use it? Right?
Yeah. And so, for me, this is thinking about different ways of measuring the value of these solutions. And it can be in terms of, are we allowing human workers to do things more? Are we increasing the quality of the output? Is the time to response or time to production shorter somehow? Are we making fewer errors? Are we increasing the ability to train otherwise limited skill sets? by pairing up. There's sometimes cases where you need to use AI, and we're seeing quite a bit of interest in this in the context of RFP applications, for example. And we learn for highly technical firms, the individuals that have the know-how just don't exist. And so AI then becomes a way to increase supply or the ability to apply to these sorts of things. The most naive approach in my mind about thinking about AI is treating it as a time-saving tool and then counting that as the value. And I think that the case studies or the news headlines like Klarna saying their customer service bot is now doing the work of 700 people, they're cutting their agency spend by X, it over-sensationalizes it. And it doesn't focus on, wait, there are so many other ways these AI-based products or workflows can add value.
Well, I think that's true. Right? It's a focus on value versus cost. And I mean, they both matter in some extent. But to the point of what's really going to bring your organization forward, it's thinking about the extra value it can add, I think is really it's important.
For sure.
What are the flags that you're like, walk away or run?
Yes, this is one of our first questions. Whenever a client approaches us and says, we would like to use AI to do X, one of my first questions is immediately, well, what are humans doing today? And big red flag is, oh, well, we couldn't, or we didn't, or we're not doing that. AI is going to help us do it. And there are very few situations where that actually makes sense. I can be convinced otherwise, where I'm like, oh, I get it. Maybe the scale of information wasn't possible, or we didn't have generative systems a few years ago to be able to plug into contact centers. That being said, many tasks where AI is either augmenting or automating parts of the task, you're generally trying to look for those problems that are repetitive, high in toil, and generally have human expert consensus. And so if we're building something that's going to be used in the context of responding to customer inquiries, do equally trained individuals on your customer experience team generally respond the same way? If we're building something for radiologists, do they diagnose a condition consistently along the same indicators? And the reason why that matters is we found from experience that when humans can't agree, the patterns in the data and the observations needed to train or fine tune these models are inconsistent. And so then the models can't converge on a solution. Add to that, or that's compounded by the fact that when you don't already have a good human process, you don't necessarily have a good way to evaluate the models. And there's two things we're looking at here. There's how accurate the model is, and that's stats. We can absolutely do that day in, day out as data science professionals. But then there's what impact is this model having in the real world? And in terms of the example we talked about, how many different clinical decisions are being made differently, for example, could be a KPI, or how many customer inquiries are we resolving in less than 2 minutes or 3 minutes on a call? And if you have humans doing it today, chances are you already have robust KPIs that you've trusted and you know their connection from that function to the bottom line of the business. And if you don't have humans doing it today, you might need to go through a little bit of discovery first to determine how you're even going to evaluate the efficacy of these AI-based workflows.
Oh, that makes so much sense, right? I have to have a definition. I have to have some bumpers and borders in place that I can train it on. Obviously, if we all disagree on an answer, that it's not going to learn something. And then I think both the accuracy, which has lots of different layers, but then the impact, right? If it's, how often does this come up? Like if it only comes up once, in a blue moon, then this is maybe not the place to like spend the energy in the tool. And like, okay.
Maybe just have a human do it. That's okay. Like there's nothing wrong with that.
Yes. Humans are still good. But I do think it's really, we were talking about this beforehand too, like a really interesting sort of mind thing to think about is how, and can AI help us create more human-centered products, right? And not replacing the human in any part of it, particularly not the end user, but like, how do we use that to make those products that really deliver value and work the way we as humans expect and want it to do?
I love the notion of, and I hate that everybody's calling it co-pilot now, and that word has caught, fire lately, but I do like this notion of tools that are intuitive that we can converse with, but aren't just a chatbot. So imagine, your inbox with a summary bar along the side telling you action items requested of you from each email that you can then say, who was the individual, or remind me some information about what their role was, or you can dig for information in a more intuitive way. There's an umbrella term that's starting to become a little bit more popular, and it's called generative experiences. And when we think about how generative AI can make products more human, you can take almost any technically intensive process, let's say coding, or even understanding how to work a highly technical product. And you can imagine there's documentation up on one side, and then there might be some diagrams or some more details that you're trying to drill into. And the traditional way of laying that information out is like manuals or the digital version of it. You've got to search for information and navigate it all, versus a generative experience might be a simple interface that has a handful of high-level bullets that you can then say, tell me more about this piece. And then you start a conversation, and then it expands. And then you ask and answer questions in the way you need to learn about it. And of course, you can always reference the full guide or body of knowledge. But, imagine an experience like that that's then paired with a coding window that allows you to code as you're doing that exploration, or a writing window where you get to write copy or a report as you're drilling into information, or looking at different ways of visualizing a concept, for example. And so it just moves out of this world of chat into an actual experience that starts off simple, but is guided by a user to uncover facets of knowledge that's most relevant to them, and then always reference back the original source of knowledge when that's helpful.
I love the idea of generative experience. And it also made me think, right, that is where generative AI is it's why it caught on, right? It is so much more accessible to those of us who did not, in any one of our majors, involve data, right? Right? So like the way you could interact with it before wasn't human-centered, and it required one of you. Right?
For sure. Right? And that's why everyone's getting so excited about it. Now, the flip side of it is it's created this false perception of, well, why do I need to hire experts? I'll just, give the rookies access to a generative experience. No problem. There's this great article by Ethan Mollick I read the other week that just captures the gist of this. And they're like, human experts are needed. What happens with these tools, because now it's so easy to ask a question. I can give you a very technical PhD level data science-y question, and you can now take that question and get an answer out of ChatGPT. But the level of which we could then evaluate the response and say that, wait, this is valid information, or, oh, I don't trust this. It's going to vary. And the same would be true of an expert PhD level product question that you're asking of me. And so the world of experts are still needed. But we might arrive at the answer faster or explore more possibilities quicker.
I always feel like I am more confident and comfortable using the tool in areas that I am very knowledgeable, because then I can be like, yep, nope. And it feels like it helps me go back and forth. I can also, I can help it refine itself, because I'm like, no, that's not how that works. Right. Exactly. But if I'm going out there on something I don't know, I'm just like, well, I mean, it sounds good, but
well, I mean, chances are you're already asking better questions too.
Right. Yes. And I do think the other piece of that is we have to remember, if we're just relying on sort of the answers from generative AI, so can any of my other competitors, right? Like,
for sure.
The expertise is part of the differentiation, and it's an important part of, it's why it's an experience, right? It's like, I can flag you for human involvement because of this, not replace the humans.
Absolutely.
So one of the other areas I know you're super passionate about is kind of responsible AI. and the ethical aspects of it, which are always, particularly talked about with healthcare and examples and government. But honestly, guys, it matters no matter what you do, right?
Yeah.
And we see some of the other extreme, the scary, here's you guys, everyone getting together to say that, hey, if we're not careful, AI will take over the world. So tell me a little bit about why it's so important to you, and really what are some just really good sort of stakes in the ground that you think people need to follow?
So I'm going to make a safe assumption here and say that everybody listening to this has good intentions when it comes to using AI. And it's true. There are individuals with bad intentions out there that are using AI to make them more efficient scammers or hackers, whatnot. We're not talking about those individuals right now.
Those people should stop listening right now.
This is the people that care about.
Right, we don't want those people.
So the reality is there's a lot of unintended consequences. And if you look up the Stanford Human-Centered AI Research Lab, they put out a state of AI report every year. And one of the charts that they put is tracking AI incidents. And these incidents are examples of algorithms discriminating against people of color in healthcare readmissions, or Apple's credit card that offered a higher credit limit to women versus men in the same household, all else being equal. And situations like Dr. Joy Buolamwini's investigation into computer vision that showcased that most of the big tech providers, household names, their computer vision models could not accurately recognize women of color. And so these incidents have been on the rise even before generative AI hit the scene. And the data cuts off in 2023, and you see the start of a hockey stick. It's not because the hockey stick itself is not because there are malicious individuals out there, but it's because that there are a number of these unintended consequences that result from AI, and more specifically from our ability to build these AI-based workflows faster and cheaper than ever before. So that's something that is so central to our practice, where we want to try to understand what are some of the hidden ways that harmful representations show up in patterns or data sets. And just a couple of examples, like if you're trying to build an algorithm to help you screen resumes faster, which makes sense. If you're a company that gets hundreds of thousands of resumes, you cannot possibly have a human go through it all. And so algorithmic aid makes sense. But if your most successful candidates are white men, guess what the model's going to learn? And Amazon learned this the hard way 5 or 6 years ago when they attempted to do this. No matter how hard they tried, they couldn't get the models to stop being biased against women. At first, they had to remove things from resumes like indications of gender, like men's soccer team, women's chess club. And then they found that the model started keying off of passive and active forms of writing. And there was no way to extract that out of the resumes. And so they had to put the project on hold. So when it comes to responsible AI, which I differentiate from being ethical or ethical AI, it's this notion of recognizing that these models have a tendency of keying off of patterns that humans might not be aware to check, like active, passive forms of writing, or there are certain correlated factors, like in a purchasing database or credit card transactions, that might unintentionally reveal someone's ethnicity, cultural background, religious beliefs, donation to a church, for example. And so there's all of these correlated protected factors that exist in data sets that may cause models to learn or infer the wrong thing. And as a part of being responsible with AI, it's making sure that you're going through due process to stress test models, expose them to unexpected situations, and also setting up the guardrails in advance, both from a process perspective, but also from a technological perspective, based on the severity of where you're using it. Are you using it to send out marketing campaigns? That's probably lower risk than using it to make clinical determinations or approving loans or scanning financial documents. And I use this cheat sheet where it's the complexity of your data versus the complexity of what you're trying to do. So simple is spreadsheets, and you have documents, images, and audio and video. The more complex your data is, the harder it is to inspect it. We can write rules to query databases. It gets harder with documents. It's near impossible with image and video. And then the more complex your goal is, if you're counting how much of something is there or predicting a future state, you can always audit it. If we're doing things like summarizing text or creating a script, it gets very hard to define what correct is, because there's many equally correct ways of saying something. And also sometimes there's no wrong answer. So you have this intersection of these two things. It's hard to inspect your data, and then it's hard to define what incorrect is. And the higher up into the right in that scenario you go, you get high complexity goals, high complexity data. You need to resort to additional risk management tactics and techniques.
So that all makes sense. But I think it's also one of the reasons that a lot of companies that are startups or that are on the smaller side struggle with figuring out how to leverage AI the right way, right? Either they feel like they can't do it at all, or they're like, well, that all sounds super good, Cal, but like, well, I only have so many resources, right? So like, how do you do that without Cal and his team? Or what's the suggestion there?
Unpopular opinion, but an AI model that has not been audited is not a good AI model, period. That being said, there are many choices between building your own model from scratch
fair.
And like being reliant on third-party tools. A good starting point that we recommend is asking vendors that you're working with, for model or data cards. Model and data cards are like the nutritional labels that when you get your food, and sometimes they're unintelligible, sure, but it contains an FDA mandated list of everything that is in that food. And you can reference it, and it's standardized. Today, model and data cards aren't as standardized, but the thoughtful providers go through the efforts of putting this documentation out. And so start with that. If you don't have the ability to do it in-house, that's fine, but depend on someone else that has gone through that effort first, and then figure out how you're going to extend it. And no matter what you do, always have an evaluation plan in place, period.
And I think also when you were talking earlier about KPIs, knowing the KPIs, but also knowing you need to have evaluation and gates, and you need to understand what is a minimally acceptable performance level.
For sure.
For all of these factors, right? For accuracy, for the number of times, but like, for, you know what I mean? Like, you need to have very transparent rules and conversations, which can be very hard when people feel like they just have to go so fast.
For sure. And, here's the thing. We talked about it at the start of our conversation. I'll bring it back. AI is wrong some amount of the time.
Yeah.
And I get the pressure as a startup founder. I was there. Yeah. There's this temptation to say, it works, don't worry.
Close enough.
Close enough, right? So I almost feel like, let's stop trying to treat AI like it's going to solve the full problem and get ahead of it. Like, actually have a good answer to the question of what happens when it's wrong.
Yeah.
And how wrong is it likely to be? And what do you do? What's your backup? How do you work around it in those instances? And those are really critical questions that any product person responsible for an AI function, feature, or product absolutely needs to have in their back pocket.
Yeah. And I think it's an understanding we need to make sure when we're getting pressure, as we do get from the executive team to hey, let's get this in there so I can tell the board so that everyone's happy, my investment team.
Yeah.
Right. I get it. We all get it. But these are still conversations we need to have so that there is alignment with the executive team and the decision makers, that we understand what this process is going to look like, and where is the opportunity and where are the risks.
Pretty sure.
And this is probably something you do with clients, or certainly have seen, like really trying to get that data literacy and understanding with the rest of the team. So do you have any hints, help, thoughtful advice?
I describe workforce literacy unfolding over the last 3 decades like this. We started with digital literacy. And by the end of the 2000s, in order to stay relevant in the workforce, you needed to be able to do basic spreadsheet processing and word processing. And then we had the era of data literacy, which we're now starting to just get to critical mass. And this is at the start of the decade, most functions did not need to know how to interpret dashboards. In fact, we didn't have tools like Power BI and Tableau. And now you can't be an analyst or an executive without having some ability to interact with charts, interpret them, know when to trust them, ask better questions. And the sad truth is, organizations are still struggling to get data literacy right.
Yeah.
I think there's a survey by TDWI that was released earlier this year that says fewer than 33% of analytics professionals are satisfied with data literacy at their orgs. So now we're moving into, or we're in the early days of what I'm calling the AI literacy wave. And this is knowing when to trust these AI-based systems, knowing what questions to ask, knowing what the right things to build are, and when to balance or how to balance human versus AI. And even taking a step back and saying, should we, even if we can? So I think that skill needs to continue to grow and mature. And that's one of the easiest ways organizations can invest in getting their workforce AI ready. And we take it a step further, no pun intended, but we break it down into these 3 different buckets. There's AI safety. And this is just saying, hey, AI-based phishing attacks are out there. This is how sensitive data can unintentionally be compromised when used with these systems. Just be a better citizen when it comes to using these tools. This is simple. This is 30 minutes to an hour with some basic knowledge checks. Everybody in every organization needed this yesterday. Then there's 2, AI literacy. And this is really starting to dive into the foundations. When do you trust it? How do you think about AI in context of your workflow? And then how does it break? And this is really important for executives, individuals in roles whose workflows are heavily impacted by AI. And then the last level of training, and this is the broadest, this is AI readiness. This is role and tool specific. So learning to program with GitHub Copilot, learning to do data analysis with ChatGPT or Microsoft Copilot, learning to write with Writer or Gemini or Jasper, any number of tools out there. And if you treat this all as just AI training, it doesn't get done.
Yeah, no, that's smart. And it's also, I think it's very eye-opening when you talk about data literacy, which we've been working on for a long time. And if we're only a third of the way there, with AI being so much newer and moving so fast, right? That it is something we all have to recognize the limitations of. And realize that we're going to be having these conversations, explaining to our peers the opportunities and the non-opportunities a long time. It's going to be a lot of learning curve.
Oh, we're just getting started. I don't believe for a moment we have hit peak hype. And I think that the next few years are going to be a lot of building, not because the technology doesn't exist, but just because we haven't quite figured out how to combine it with human expertise the right way. So there's going to be a few more bumps along the road, but the good news is there's a lot of opportunity to do some great work here.
All right. I also do want to ask, because we've seen, we're on version 4s, 0.0s and et cetera of things. And so we've seen it move really fast, right?
Yeah.
What do you see? What do you see as what's coming next, right? What do you think are the areas that we're really going to see movement in?
Were that I was given the crystal ball.
Yes, exactly.
I don't think anyone really knows the answer.
Oh, interesting.
But I will take a guess.
Okay.
I'm willing to bet that models will continue to improve. I think we will likely reach a ceiling in perceived rate of improvement. Just, for a couple of reasons. One, the quality data needed to continue scaling these models is not keeping up with the exponential growth of our ability to compute. And so one of the assumptions of, I'm sure you've seen, and many folks have seen those charts that are, look at the compute, and as we've gotten more flops and we've gotten more data, we've been able to get GPT 2, 3, 4.0, et cetera. And so there's a reasonable belief that it'll continue accelerating. We're running out of quality labeled data, and there's only so much
that
more.
That quality labeled piece is a big, I'm like, there's so much. Oh, right. Yes. Yeah, it's terrible.
Human experts actually need to produce this.
Yes.
And sure, you can use generative AI to simulate some parts of it. And there's little tricks you can use. So I think we're going to continue to get better models. But I don't know how much longer, how realistic this, we're looking at the, top of the hype curve and we just can't see the top of it. I think that it'll look like it's slowing down, but it's not. We're going to start taking these kinds of principles and use them to solve other problems. And so already we're seeing breakthroughs in drug discovery, for example, and finding ways to manufacture products or materials in ways that were originally non-intuitive. So I think we're going to experience this horizontal proliferation of useful forms of AI or AI-based workflows into other professions. And I think actually, ironically, the outcome of all of this is that AI is going to stop being so special. It's going to be software. Yeah. And we saw this happen with software and tech. Tech used to be one thing. And then as software, right? Yeah. It's now ubiquitous, and it's almost useless to call yourself a technology company.
Right.
And there's a brief, sweetheart window of 5 years where you could be cool and say, we are a tech company. We are not an X company. And then nobody says that anymore. No. So I think the same will be true of AI.
Wow. You heard it here. You got your bets. Bets on Cal. All right. Okay. My final question. We talked about a ton of different things, right? So if you were going to have listeners do 2 things differently tomorrow, based on what we talked about today, what would it be?
So I'll start with my most unconventional. Make it boring, right? So if all of the things we talked about today sounded familiar, like, oh yeah, we do this with quality control, or oh yeah, we do this with process management, that's good. A lot of standard practice actually works really well for AI. And when you start treating it like you treat every other function that you're managing a risk of, or measuring the value or performance of, it stops being this thing on a pedestal that you have no control over. And you start to think about practical ways to use it. So I encourage everybody to find ways to make AI more boring, because it belongs behind the scenes. 2, think about not just AI or human, but how does AI and human-based workflows look? Or how does that combination look? And whenever you're thinking about an AI-based product or function or adopting a tool, consider that it'll be wrong some amount of the time. So how do you balance what you or human experts are going to do in those situations? And what does that work like? That's really succeeding with AI.
All right. AI should be boring. And it should always be human plus AI, not an
Absolutely.
or. Right. And I think it can sound scary when you're like, it'll be wrong some of the time. Like, we're all wrong some of the time. Right. It's not a problem that it's wrong. It is a problem if we're pretending it doesn't happen, or if we haven't thought about the situations when it is. Right. Yes. Cal, this was amazing. I really appreciate your time. And Oreo, who came in and out a few times. Thank you also for your thoughts and experiences. You could tell the cat is very interested in AI, but it was a great conversation. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. That does it for today's episode. Thank you, everyone, for listening. A couple of reminders, please. Don't forget to send a review of the podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, help other people find it. Please don't forget to send your questions in for our listeners' questions areas. That's productchats@pragmaticinstitute.com or 480-536-8635. And please don't forget to get ready to register for the Future of Product Management Summit 2024. And you'll get to hear a lot more from Cal and some other great speakers. Sure to be a good time. Thanks, everyone. Have a great week.